March 11th, 2011, 2:46 in the afternoon, Japan Standard Time. The ocean floor splits apart 130 kilometers off Japan's northeast coast. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake sends shockwaves racing through the Earth's crust at 7 kilometers per second. The most powerful earthquake in Japan's recorded history has just triggered something far worse. Beneath the Pacific Ocean, billions of tons of seawater surge upward. A tsunami begins its deadly journey toward the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The wave travels at the speed of a jetliner. It carries the force to turn the ocean itself into a radioactive weapon. Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. At Fukushima Daiichi, the earthquake hits like a freight train. The ground shakes so violently that workers can barely stand. Emergency sirens wail across the complex. 6 nuclear reactors automatically shut down their chain reactions. But stopping a nuclear reactor is like turning off a massive furnace. The fuel rods remain incredibly hot. They need constant cooling or they'll melt through their steel containers. The plant's electrical systems kick into emergency mode. Massive diesel generators roar to life. Cooling pumps circulate water through the reactor cores. Everything appears to be working. The earthquake, despite its tremendous power, has been contained. But 41 minutes later, the real killer arrives. A wall of water 14 to 15 meters high slams into Fukushima's coastline. The plant's seawall stands 5.7 meters above sea level. It was designed to withstand a tsunami less than half this size. The wave doesn't just overtop the barrier, it obliterates it. Water crashes through the facility like a liquid avalanche. It floods the basement levels where the emergency diesel generators are housed. Electrical panels explode in showers of sparks. Backup power systems drown in salt water. Within minutes, units 1 through 5 lose all electrical power. This is called a station blackout. It's the nightmare scenario every nuclear engineer fears most. Without electricity, the cooling pumps stop working. Without cooling pumps, the reactor cores begin to heat up. The fuel rods that moments ago were safely contained now face a countdown to catastrophe. They have hours before the cooling water boils away completely. Hours before the nuclear fuel begins to melt. Unit 6 survives because its air-cooled diesel generator sits higher than the flood line. It continues running, providing power to cool Units 5 and 6. But Units 1, 2, and 3 are left in darkness. Their fate now depends on battery power that will last only 8 hours. The Tokyo Electric Power Company, known as TEPCO, scrambles to restore power. Mobile generators race toward the plant, but the tsunami has destroyed roads and knocked out transmission lines. Emergency vehicles crawl through debris fields. Time is running out faster than anyone imagined. At Unit 1, the situation deteriorates first. The reactor vessel contains uranium fuel that's still producing enormous heat through radioactive decay. As the cooling water level drops, the top of the fuel assemblies becomes exposed to steam. The metal cladding around the uranium begins to react with superheated water vapor. This reaction produces hydrogen gas, invisible, odorless, and explosively dangerous. By early morning, on March 12th, hydrogen gas fills the upper levels of Unit 1's reactor building. Plant workers know the danger. They try to vent the gas safely, but their systems are damaged. Their procedures are overwhelmed. The hydrogen continues to accumulate in an increasingly unstable mixture. At 3:36 in the afternoon, on March 12th, Unit 1 explodes. The hydrogen detonation destroys the reactor building's upper floors. Concrete and steel debris rain down across the facility. Radioactive material escapes into the atmosphere. The explosion is caught on camera and broadcast worldwide. The images are shocking. A nuclear power plant literally blown apart. But this is only the beginning. Unit 3 follows the same deadly pattern. Loss of cooling leads to fuel exposure. Fuel exposure creates hydrogen gas. On March 14th at 11:01 in the morning, Unit 3 explodes in an even more violent detonation. The blast sends a mushroom cloud of radioactive debris hundreds of meters into the sky. Unit 2 avoids a hydrogen explosion in its reactor building. But early on March 15th, an explosion rocks the suppression chamber. This underground structure is supposed to contain radioactive material during emergencies. Its failure opens a direct pathway for contamination to escape. The same day, Unit 4 faces its own crisis. The reactor was offline for maintenance, but its spent fuel pool contains over 1,500 assemblies of used nuclear fuel. These assemblies continue producing heat and radiation. Without cooling, the water level in the pool drops dangerously low. Reports of a fire in Unit 4's spent fuel pool send emergency teams into panic. If the pool boils dry, the exposed fuel could ignite. The resulting fire would spread radioactive material across a vast area. Though the fire is quickly extinguished, the threat reveals how close Japan has come to an even greater catastrophe. By March 15th, 3 reactor cores have suffered partial meltdowns. Radioactive material pours into the atmosphere. Contaminated water leaks into the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese government orders evacuations within 20 kilometers of the plant. Nearly 200,000 people flee their homes. But the ocean contamination is just beginning. April 2nd, 2011. 22 days after the tsunami, TEPCO workers discover something that turns their blood cold. Highly radioactive water is gushing from a cracked concrete pit near Unit 2. The leak flows directly into the Pacific Ocean at over 1,000 millisieverts per hour. That's enough radiation to deliver a lethal dose in less than 5 hours. The contaminated water carries cesium-137, iodine-131, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes. It pours into the sea at an estimated 300 tons per day. Every second, billions of becquerels of radioactivity join the ocean currents. The Pacific Ocean is becoming a radioactive highway. TEPCO tries everything to stop the leak. They pour concrete into the pit. The concrete washes away. They inject a polymer gel designed to seal cracks. It fails. They pump in sawdust, shredded newspaper, even absorbent diapers. Nothing works. For 6 days, radioactive water streams uncontrolled into the sea. When the leak is finally plugged on April 6th, the damage is catastrophic. Seawater near the plant shows cesium-137 levels of 65,000 becquerels per liter. Iodine-131 reaches 150,000 becquerels per liter. These concentrations are tens of thousands of times higher than natural background levels. But this direct discharge is only part of the story. Atmospheric fallout has been raining down on the ocean for weeks. Radioactive particles released during the explosions travel on wind currents. They fall like invisible snow across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of ocean. The contamination spreads in all directions. Nearshore monitoring stations record cesium levels 50 million times higher than pre-accident background. The radiation plume extends far beyond Japan's territorial waters. It enters international shipping lanes. It threatens fisheries that feed millions of people. Marine life becomes an unwitting test subject for humanity's worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. Fish absorb radioactive cesium through their gills and diet. Seaweed concentrates iodine-131 in its tissues. Bottom-dwelling creatures ingest contaminated sediments. The entire ocean food chain becomes a pathway for radioactive accumulation. Japanese authorities ban fishing in waters near the plant, but contaminated fish swim freely across political boundaries. Bluefin tuna caught off California in August 2011 contained detectable levels of Fukushima-derived cesium. These fish were juveniles when the accident occurred. They carried radioactivity across the entire Pacific basin. The discovery sends shockwaves through international markets. Consumers avoid Japanese seafood. Import bans spread across Asia and beyond. Japan's fishing industry, already devastated by the tsunami, faces complete collapse in some regions. Scientists estimate that 5.1 to 5.5 petabecquerels of cesium-137 enter the ocean directly during the worst weeks of discharge. That's equivalent to the cesium content of hundreds of nuclear weapons. When atmospheric fallout and ongoing leaks are included, total ocean contamination may reach 15 to 30 petabecquerels. The numbers are staggering, but their meaning is debated. Some experts argue that the vast Pacific Ocean will dilute the contamination to harmless levels. Others warn of concentrated hotspots and unknown biological effects. The truth lies somewhere between panic and complacency. Marine monitoring stations track the radioactive plume as it spreads eastward. Computer models predict when contamination will reach the North American coast. The answer: 2 to 3 years for significant detection. By November 2014, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution confirms cesium-134 in waters off Northern California. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The detection levels are low, far below health thresholds, but they represent something unprecedented: radioactive contamination from a nuclear accident circling the globe through ocean currents. The Pacific has become a laboratory for studying how nuclear accidents spread through marine ecosystems. Back at Fukushima, the water crisis continues. Groundwater flows downhill toward the ocean. It passes beneath the damaged reactors, becoming contaminated with radioactive materials. This contaminated groundwater seeps into the sea at an estimated 300 tons per day. The leak is smaller than the April crisis, but it's constant. Every day, more radioactivity enters the Pacific. TEPCO installs an underground ice wall around the reactor buildings. Pipes filled with frozen coolant create a barrier designed to block groundwater flow. The system costs over $300 million. It reduces contamination, but doesn't eliminate it. The battle against radioactive water becomes a permanent feature of the cleanup. Storage tanks proliferate across the Fukushima site. Each tank holds contaminated water that's too radioactive to release, but too voluminous to store indefinitely. By 2020, over 1 million tons of treated water fill more than 1,000 tanks. The storage crisis threatens to overwhelm the entire facility. The Advanced Liquid Processing System, known as ALPS, removes most radioactive isotopes from the contaminated water. But it cannot eliminate tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen. Tritium is nearly impossible to separate from water because it is water. The treated water still contains billions of becquerels of tritium. Japanese officials face an impossible choice: release the tritium-contaminated water into the ocean or run out of storage space. Environmental groups demand permanent storage. Fishing communities threaten lawsuits. International pressure mounts from all directions. The debate rages for years. Scientists argue that tritium poses minimal health risks at planned discharge levels. Critics question long-term accumulation effects. The decision becomes as much about public trust as scientific evidence. On August 24, 2023, TEPCO begins controlled discharge of ALPS-treated water into the Pacific Ocean. The decision triggers immediate international backlash. China imposes a nationwide ban on Japanese seafood imports. Protesters gather outside Japanese embassies worldwide. The discharge program is planned to continue for decades. Each release is monitored by international observers. Tritium levels remain well below safety limits. But the symbolism is powerful. Japan is deliberately adding radioactive water to the ocean that was accidentally contaminated 12 years earlier. The Pacific Ocean has absorbed the equivalent of multiple nuclear weapons worth of radioactive material. Marine ecosystems continue adapting to contamination levels never before encountered, and the long-term consequences remain unknown. What happens when an entire ocean becomes a test case for nuclear accident recovery? The answer is still being written in the currents of the Pacific. March 12, 2011, 6 in the morning. Japanese Prime Minister Naoto Kan stares at radiation readings that shouldn't exist outside a war zone. Dosimeters near Unit 3 register 400 millisieverts per hour. That's enough to exceed annual safety limits for nuclear workers in just 2.5 hours. The government faces an impossible decision. How far is far enough when radiation has no borders? The evacuation begins with a 2-kilometer radius around the plant, then 10 kilometers, then 20. Each expansion displaces tens of thousands more people. Families grab whatever they can carry. Parents clutch children who don't understand why they can't go home. Elderly residents refuse to leave houses they've lived in for decades. By March 13th, 185,000 people have fled the Fukushima exclusion zone. Entire towns empty within hours. Schools close mid-semester. Hospitals evacuate critical patients. The evacuation becomes the largest peacetime displacement in Japan's modern history. But 20 kilometers isn't enough. Radioactive plumes follow wind patterns that ignore evacuation boundaries. Northwest of the plant, contamination settles in valleys and forests far beyond the exclusion zone. The village of Iitate sits 40 kilometers away. It should be safe. Instead, it becomes one of the most contaminated places outside the evacuation zone. Radiation surveys reveal the cruel randomness of nuclear contamination. Some areas within the 20-kilometer zone show relatively low levels. Other locations far outside register readings that would trigger immediate evacuation. The evacuation boundaries, drawn in perfect circles on maps, bear little resemblance to the chaotic reality of radioactive fallout. U.S. Department of Energy aerial surveys detect hotspots with readings above 125 microsieverts per hour at distances of 25 kilometers northwest. These levels exceed safety thresholds for long-term habitation. Japanese authorities face mounting pressure to expand evacuations even further. On April 22nd, the government orders Iitate village to evacuate completely. The announcement comes 6 weeks after the accident. Residents have been living in contaminated territory for over a month. Some have received radiation doses equivalent to multiple medical X-rays every day. The delayed evacuation highlights the chaos of emergency response during an unprecedented crisis. Officials struggle with incomplete information. Radiation monitoring systems have been damaged by the earthquake and tsunami. Computer models conflict with field measurements. Decisions that should be based on science become exercises in political judgment. Evacuation centers overflow with displaced families. Temporary housing springs up in gymnasiums and community centers. Children sleep on folding cots surrounded by strangers. Elderly residents develop depression and anxiety disorders. Some refuse medical treatment, believing they're already contaminated beyond help. The psychological toll equals the radiological threat. Families split apart as some members evacuate while others stay behind. Farmers abandon livestock that starve in empty fields. Business owners watch decades of work become radioactive waste. The evacuation doesn't just displace people, it destroys communities. Emergency workers face their own impossible choices. Radiation levels at the plant exceed normal occupational limits within minutes. The Japanese government raises emergency worker dose limits from 100 millisieverts to 250 millisieverts. Some workers volunteer to exceed even these elevated limits. They become known as the Fukushima 50, though the actual number fluctuates between several dozen and several hundred. These workers cycle in and out of the most dangerous areas. They work in full protective equipment under extreme time pressure. One worker receives an estimated 670 millisieverts during the emergency response period. The heroism is real, but so is the cost. Japan recognizes its first radiation-linked worker death in September 2018. A plant employee develops lung cancer after receiving approximately 195 millisieverts of exposure. The case takes 7 years to officially recognize the radiation link. Meanwhile, the evacuation zone becomes a living laboratory for studying radiation effects on human communities. Researchers track cancer rates, mental health outcomes, and social disruption across the displaced population. The data will take decades to fully analyze. Children become a particular focus of concern. Young people are more sensitive to radiation effects. They face a lifetime of potential health monitoring. Some families relocate permanently to other parts of Japan. Others return as soon as authorities allow, determined to rebuild their lives in familiar places. The evacuation creates a patchwork of ghost towns and recovery zones. Some areas remain off limits for years, others reopen gradually as radiation levels decline. By April 1st, 2017, most evacuation orders outside the most contaminated zones are lifted, but many residents never return. The population of Fukushima Prefecture drops by over 160,000 people at its peak. Some areas see 90% population decline. Schools close permanently, hospitals relocate. Entire municipal governments operate from temporary facilities in other prefectures. Recovery becomes a test of human resilience against invisible threats. Families debate whether it's safe to return. Scientists provide probabilistic risk assessments that offer little comfort to parents worried about their children's futures. The numbers say the risk is small, but small risks feel enormous when they involve your family. By June 2022, evacuation order areas have shrunk from 1,150 square kilometers to 327 square kilometers. The progress is measurable but incomplete. Some communities may never recover their pre-accident populations. The most contaminated areas remain off-limits indefinitely. These difficult-to-return zones contain homes, schools, and businesses frozen in time since March 2011. Nature slowly reclaims abandoned buildings. Wild boars roam empty streets. The exclusion zone becomes an accidental wildlife preserve in a radioactive landscape. Compensation payments total over 10 trillion yen, but money cannot restore what radiation has taken. The evacuation of Fukushima displaces not just people but an entire way of life. Rural communities that existed for generations disappear in the space of hours. The human cost of nuclear accidents cannot be measured only in radiation doses. It must include the destruction of communities, the trauma of displacement, and the loss of places that can never truly be home again. And this evacuation, comprehensive as it seems, may not be the last. because radiation doesn't follow human boundaries, and the contamination is still spreading. January 30th, 2024. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirms that 23,400 cubic meters of treated radioactive water have been discharged into the Pacific Ocean. The number sounds clinical, bureaucratic, but it represents something unprecedented: the deliberate release of contaminated water from the world's second worst nuclear accident. The discharge continues today. It will continue for decades. Each release sparks fresh controversy about what we owe the ocean. 13 years after the tsunami, Fukushima Daiichi remains a monument to nuclear catastrophe and human determination. The site employs over 4,000 workers daily. They wear protective equipment to perform routine maintenance in an environment that would have been unimaginable before March 11th, 2011. The reactor buildings still contain an estimated 880 tons of melted nuclear fuel. This debris exists in forms never before encountered. Some fuel has mixed with concrete and steel to create radioactive lava-like formations. Other material has pooled in basement areas flooded with contaminated water. Removing this fuel debris will require technologies that don't yet exist. Robots designed for the task fail within hours in the extreme radiation environment. Remote-controlled devices melt or malfunction. The fuel removal process, originally scheduled for the 2020s, has been pushed back repeatedly. Current estimates suggest the cleanup will take 40 years and cost over $200 billion. These projections assume technological breakthroughs that may never come. The reality could be far longer and more expensive, but cleanup costs pale beside the broader reckoning with nuclear power. Fukushima forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about reactor safety, corporate accountability, and the true price of nuclear energy. The accident exposed fundamental flaws in nuclear safety culture. TEPCO had ignored warnings about tsunami risks for years. Internal documents revealed that company executives knew the plant's seawalls were inadequate. They chose not to upgrade defenses because of cost and regulatory complexity. This pattern of negligence wasn't unique to Japan. Nuclear plants worldwide had similar vulnerabilities. Emergency planning focused on design-basis accidents, not the kind of multiple system failures that occurred at Fukushima. The accident became a stress test for the entire nuclear industry. Germany responded by accelerating its nuclear phase-out. Italy abandoned plans for new reactor construction. Switzerland imposed a moratorium on nuclear development. Public opinion shifted decisively against nuclear power in many countries. Japan itself shut down all 54 of its nuclear reactors for safety reviews. The country that once embraced nuclear energy as a path to energy independence found itself importing record amounts of fossil fuels. Electricity prices soared. Carbon emissions increased. The economic impact rippled through Japanese society. Only 10 Japanese reactors have restarted under new safety standards implemented after Fukushima. The Nuclear Regulation Authority, established in September 2012, imposed stricter requirements for tsunami protection, backup power systems, and severe accident management, but public trust remains shattered. The health consequences of Fukushima continue to unfold slowly. The World Health Organization concluded in 2013 that radiation exposure levels were too low to cause observable increases in cancer rates. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reached similar conclusions in 2020. But these reassurances provide cold comfort to Fukushima residents. Children undergo thyroid cancer screening that reveals increased detection rates. Scientists debate whether this reflects radiation effects or improved screening protocols. The uncertainty itself becomes a source of ongoing anxiety. Mental health impacts prove more measurable than physical effects. Suicide rates increased in evacuated communities. Depression and anxiety disorders spike among displaced residents. The psychological damage from nuclear accidents extends far beyond radiation exposure. Food safety remains a persistent concern. Japan implemented the world's strictest radioactivity limits for agricultural products. Extensive monitoring reduces contaminated food, reaching consumers to negligible levels. But consumer confidence recovers slowly. International markets gradually reopened to Japanese food exports. The European Union lifted its import restrictions in 2017. The United States followed in 2021. But China's seafood ban, implemented after the treated water discharge began, demonstrates how Fukushima continues affecting trade relationships. The ocean discharge represents the most controversial chapter in Fukushima's aftermath. TEPCO and the Japanese government insist that tritium releases meet international safety standards. Independent monitoring by the IAEA confirms compliance with technical requirements. But technical compliance doesn't address emotional and cultural objections. Pacific Island nations fear contamination of waters they consider sacred. Fishing communities worry about market perception, even if radiation levels remain safe. The decision to discharge treated water becomes a test of scientific authority versus public anxiety. The precedent troubles nuclear experts worldwide. If ocean discharge becomes an accepted solution for nuclear waste, what prevents future accidents from following the same path? The Pacific Ocean absorbed Fukushima's contamination not by choice but by circumstance. China's trade retaliation demonstrates how nuclear accidents create lasting geopolitical consequences. Scientific evidence about safety levels cannot overcome political calculations and public emotions. Fukushima radiation becomes a diplomatic weapon years after the accident itself. Meanwhile, Japan grapples with the fundamental question of nuclear power's future. The country needs carbon-free energy to meet climate commitments. Nuclear power offers proven technology for large-scale electricity generation, but Fukushima demonstrated that even advanced nuclear nations face catastrophic risks. The tragedy extends beyond Japan's borders. Fukushima changed global perceptions of nuclear safety. It demonstrated that modern reactor designs, regulatory oversight, and emergency planning could all fail simultaneously. The accident shattered assumptions about controlled nuclear technology. Yet nuclear power advocates argue that Fukushima's lessons support better reactor design, not nuclear abandonment. They point to improved safety systems, enhanced emergency procedures, and stronger regulatory frameworks. The question becomes whether society can accept residual risks from technologies that offer significant benefits. 13 years later, Fukushima Daiichi continues leaking radioactivity into the Pacific Ocean. The discharge is controlled now, monitored and measured. But it's still happening. Every day, more contamination enters waters that connect all nations. The accident that began with an earthquake and tsunami continues through human choices about acceptable risk and environmental burden. We're still deciding how much radioactivity the ocean should absorb. We're still learning what nuclear accidents cost in money, health, and trust. The Pacific remembers what we prefer to forget, that some disasters never truly end. They just become part of the background, like radiation itself, invisible, measurable, permanent. What legacy will we leave in the currents that circle the globe? The answer flows past Fukushima every day, carrying our choices toward shores we'll never see. If this story changed how you think about the true cost of nuclear power, hit that subscribe button. Help us tell the stories that matter. Because the next generation deserves to understand the waves we've set in motion and the decisions that still lie ahead.